So we talked about the need to invest in R&D and development of the pipeline for the future security of that production that we are looking to establish on the African continent. So clinical trials are a big challenge in African countries. The African Academy of Science clinical trials community says that only 2% of clinical trials globally for all types of vaccines are being done in African nations. And yet there's a perception that amongst us as African people, that there's a disproportionate number of trials being done in Africa, and everybody wants to use us as guinea pigs and hurt us with their products. How much of a problem is this going to be for our efforts to establish long-term R&D capabilities to test those products as we go forward in the R&D development process?
So I think obviously we're talking about an issue of trust and confidence here with respect to how clinical trials are perceived and received in countries and in local and by local communities. I think the key thing to appreciate that you can't demand trust. Trust needs to be built, and it needs to be built over time, and track record and confidence generates trust. So I think this is a journey that we have to go on. But I think one of the benefits of having local production is that to an extent you remove the issue of outsiders coming into the continent wanting to use us as guinea pigs, because guys, this factory is down the road from you, or it's on the continent. They've done this trial. The product was developed in South Africa. They've done a trial in South Africa, and now they want to test this in Uganda, and now they want to roll it out in Kenya. And likewise, production might have been in Nigeria. First human clinical trials are done in Nigeria, and then they need to be expanded. This is all, I think, what we're looking at here is this ecosystem that we're building. A brick here, another brick there, but slowly and surely it will have a solid base where you have a multiplicity of options and capacities on the continent with respect to, in this instance, clinical trials. Now, I think the one advantage that South Africa has had to date, perhaps more so than elsewhere in Africa, is the mix of disease and the technical ability and capacity and infrastructure, which, by the way, was accelerated through our experience in South Africa with the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So there was a lot of investment in clinical trial site capacity building, which now serves the purpose for testing COVID vaccines, testing malaria vaccines, testing TB vaccines, and who knows what else. So while we talk about COVID, I think we need to understand that there is ability to accelerate and almost increase in an exponential way the capacity building just from one or two actions initially on the ground. Now, let me use this as an example, and this ties in a little bit with vaccine development capability. Before I launch off into that, let me emphasize again. I think the fact that South Africa and other African countries have developed clinical trial manufacturing capacity was because of HIV/AIDS, and that capability was built, and now it forms as a base that can serve other disease areas. And one needs to think in that way about vaccine development and about vaccine manufacture as well. So, and I'm going to take this opportunity just to focus a little bit on what we as BioVac have done in vaccine product development. So we invested in the early days, very modest team of about 15 people focused on what is called conjugate vaccine production technology. Now, all these fancy words, what do they mean? A conjugate vaccine, examples of conjugate vaccines that are currently used in the immunization programs are the pneumococcal vaccines, the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. Haemophilus influenza B that causes meningitis is also one of those vaccines. Meningococcal vaccines, the Men-A vaccine used in the meningitis belt of Africa is a conjugate vaccine. So what is a conjugate vaccine? A conjugate vaccine is simply that these pathogens, the disease-causing organisms, one of the substances, molecules on their surface, which causes their virulence, and if you block it, you can control their virulence, you can control the way they infect and the way they cause disease, is a sugar molecule. In scientific terms, it's a carbohydrate molecule, okay? And it's a polysaccharide. So we have developed the ability to grow up these pathogenic organisms, strip out this polysaccharide, the sugar, purify it, and then link it through a chemical process to a protein, and that linkage is the conjugate. The two have conjugated to each other. So we have developed a technology for Haemophilus influenza B, conjugate vaccine, and we have outward transferred that technology to 2 companies in the East and 1 in the US. So it demonstrates that this capability it's not just a pipe dream. It's happened and is happening on the continent. Now, this is just one example in vaccine vaccine development. We have gone on now to focus on the development of a new vaccine against Group B streptococcus. Now, Group B streptococcus, GBS, causes trouble in newborns. And when they're born, there's an early onset disease and there's a late onset disease, and there's huge implications in Africa, but elsewhere as well. But no vaccine exists against GBS, and BioVac is amongst a handful of companies across the world focused on this. But we are at a stage now where we've completed all the process development, we've completed all the animal testing, and we need to make clinical trial material to take it into human clinical trials. Unfortunately, we don't have the finances to do that. So we are now going through a fundraising set of activities to raise funds for that. Now, why do I make this point? Because this is not simply a GBS product. If we do take it through the clinical development process, it will teach us, it will teach the ecosystem in South Africa of how to manage, this is including the regulators, of how to manage vaccine R&D and vaccine clinical development to the point of commercialization, so that if you come around the corner and want to do it on a COVID vaccine, you know how to do it. On the next pandemic vaccine, you've been there, you've done that. So we need to see these things not as, oh, should we focus on GBS or COVID? We need to focus on the capability building, and the GBS and COVID, etc., are vehicles to get us there.
That's a really lovely story that illustrates, I think, some of the capabilities that you don't hear about, that actually exist, and that is often cited as being one of the reasons why it's impossible to think about vaccine production in Africa, that you don't have these capabilities, and yet Biovac, and I'm sure there are others who are doing things that one is not aware of. So I think that's really important, and an important point, of course, this is a vehicle. You have the process, and you could take any polysaccharide and any protein and expand in terms of the targets, target pathogens, the target diseases that you can use that for. So that's really exciting. So just speak a little bit why it is important that clinical trials are done in Africa, and what more could be done by leaders, regulators, scientists to change the perceptions in terms of at least building that capability, that understanding, that ecosystem that can support clinical trials within development of products.
So I think it's part of the end-to-end development, end-to-end capability development. So, and obviously clinical trials, as we all know, is probably the pivotal aspect of clinical development. You can do whatever you want to in the product development space, in the labs, etc. But ultimately, it's the clinical trials that are going to determine whether your product is safe and effective and stands a chance of being commercialized and having positive disease impact at the end of the process. And I think we touched on this earlier, that capacity, it's important that capacity alongside the manufacturing and development capacity, vaccine development and manufacturing capacity is built, so that we're not developing product, then having to send them outside for clinical trials and then bring them back in, because it's an unnecessary complexity within the ecosystem. Obviously, with clinical trials as well, it's a contribution to the greater socioeconomic development side of things, and also from a confidence issue about lessening the suspicion of these vaccines coming in from the outside, things that they have been tested on the outside and not in African populations. I think that local clinical trials, the need for them will never disappear. That it is a fundamental step in product development to determine whether vaccines in development are suitable in many, many different settings, from a geographic setting, from a population demographic setting, that these vaccines will need to be tested in discrete settings to compare their efficacy and see whether it's any different in setting number 1 versus setting number 2 versus setting number 3. Because this will ultimately determine the utility of the vaccine in different countries, not only in Africa, but across the world.
Absolutely. No, that's a very good point. It's important. I think it's a question that comes up a lot when you're having discussions about clinical trials. And I took, for instance, the Ebola vaccine. When it was being trialed, I was a subject in that. So I always try to share that and, sort of explain the importance of having vaccines or products, medical products that have been tested in people that share the same genetic makeup. You have different kinds of people around the world, right? You have Caucasians, Asians, Blacks rather, and that representation of different kinds of people is very important when you are looking at how a product works in a particular group of people. So very good point.